Good afternoon and welcome to our last webinar for 2019. My name's Richard Bell and I'll be your presenter for this afternoon, and we're going to cover off the last of the series in the Cayuga VMS, which relates to failover and redundancy configurations. Anyway, a few housekeeping items first up. For those of you who haven't joined us before, I'll just run through a couple of the main points to configure. Firstly, you'll see that you've muted, and please remain muted for the course of this webinar. If you have any questions, just type them here, and if time permits, I'll attempt to answer those. If not, I'll email you an answer after the end of the webinar. If there are any downloads related to the Cayuga side, you'll see them in the bottom right-hand side of the toolbar that's on your screen. And if you do need to have a bit more real estate, you can just hit the arrow at the top and minimize the screen and give you a bit more screen viewing. Anyway, let's get into this. Anyway, just a quick recap from last week, just to get you up to speed in case anybody missed the first couple, where we're looking at the Cayuga versions. Basically, as we refer to them, it's like small, medium, large, and jumbo, just depending on the size of the cameras, the amount of users, and your server side of things that you can configure. In modern day VMS deployments, the hardware also plays an important part. In typical rack mount servers from a lot of the manufacturers, they've all come with dual power supply, and their disk subsystems are configured with normally like RAID 1 or a mirrored for an OS deployment, and your video data is normally kept on a RAID 5 or RAID 6 disk array, and then you've got an option of a dedicated hot spare to kick in should there be a failure on that side of things. Anyway, we're not going to cover off the hardware today. This is just to cover the Cayuga VMS and an overview of how its hardware relates to the software implementation. And specifically, as we're going to be talking about just failover and redundancy implementations, that's going to be applicable to the Infinity X software version on your right-hand side. So, which is the top deployment that we've got in our portfolio. Anyway, this was one of the simple line architectures that we've had previously that shows the connections of the various devices, clients, cameras, analog servers, etc. It doesn't show any of the failover components. The device managers, the recording servers in other language speak, are just single devices, and there's a number of those, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But we're going to cover off a few of the additions and how they can be sliced and diced to give you the various types of failover that you can deploy for your various size systems. Anyway, here's your basic Cayuga VMS. It's got a single DM that's for recording. It's got a core service running, and that's typically known as the CSM, the core service master. And every VMS has a core service master, and there's just one of those that's within the system. Now, as the system grows and gets larger, we may end up with multiple CSSs, or what we call core service slaves, and that will vary depending on whether it's like a single site or multi-site. But when we've got failover and redundancy brought into the picture, we're also talking about having the core service slaves in there, and it just depends on your size and what your customer is looking for. So we can add DMs, as we've discussed before. The size of the DM is applicable probably to not only the cameras and resolutions, but also storage side of things. But one thing I just want to stress, and I'll say it a couple of times during the course of the webinar, that we can have our failover to another machine in Cayuga just by having a 2-server deployment. There's 2 physical pieces of hardware, and that's all that's required to have a failover situation. And let's look at like the simplest form is what I'm talking at here. DM1, DM2. Now, whether it's it doesn't really matter which side, they can go from one to the other. And as I said, there's no third-party software that's involved with the handling of the failover side of things. It is all done within the Cayuga VMS. It has its own database. There is no external databases such as SQL or any of those sort of external third-party ones to take care of. So your licensing is also an area to consider when you're looking at the total cost of deployment. We are supported on the various virtualization platforms such as like VMware, and that'll work fine. And certain corporate entities have these sorts of infrastructures deployed, and it's quite happily to work on there, but it's not a requirement. The only consideration that you're looking at here, and I've just got this as a small system, you're seeing like 50 cameras per DM, is that your hardware resources just need to be able to handle if you're failing the cameras from one to the other. So effectively, each machine has to be capable of handling 100 cameras for the period of time that you're going to be running in the failover side of things. Now, the only thing that's really necessary is just to have a fast network. So you're talking about having a minimum, of a gigabit as a connection, between it. It may be faster, sitting on the backbone, but that's just the requirement, there. So here we go from DM1 to DM2, or vice versa, DM2 back to DM1. So that's the simplest scenario. We can then step up the side, and we have like a ring concept. And you can see here that we've got 3 servers, and we just follow the red line around. DM1 can fail to DM2, and it can go to DM3, and likewise DM3 with the line down the bottom, it could fail over to DM1. Now, again, this is the most cost-effective way to have failover, on a budget. They are just all connected together, and it'll work, quite well. But again, it also depends on the size of your cameras. And again, I stress that each of the servers needs to be sized accordingly to handle that. And again, in modern day CPUs that are out there, the multi-core side that Intel have got out there, when you're looking at 6, 8 cores and that beyond, processing power these days comes priced very well compared to if you looked at a server 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. So that's not normally the bottleneck. Again, your storage side of things, how many terabytes that you need. But that's the simplest scenario when we're looking in a 3-server side of things. Again, we'll step up again, and when we're looking at a larger side of camera deployment, and again, we may have 100 cameras on each server in that scenario here, where we've allocated a dedicated hot spare DM, a recording server, sitting there. And now each of these servers, 1, 2, or 3, could go to the one sitting at the bottom of the screen. Again, it's also possible, in the highly unlikely event that you had 2 DMs fail, that they could also then go to that dedicated hot standby. That being said, if that was on the cards and being considered, you would need to size that accordingly, and you may need to have a bit more horsepower and disk storage space. The video data is kept on the failed over server for all the time. So when your servers are restored to a normal operation, so if in this case, if DM1 was the only one that was failed to a hot standby, and it comes back, the video data stays on the failover server indefinitely. the database knows, and it has pointers in the system, so it knows where the image data is for those cameras that were on that failover server. This may only be for a few minutes. It could be a few hours, or it could be the next day. What we think is the case, you're minimizing your bandwidth and your CPU utilization as well, so you're not moving files back to the original server. And again, the rules for your aging of the data, whether they're kept for 30 days or 60 days, that will all still apply with any of the data that is kept on a failover server situation. So that's what there. So that's what we've got. We just jump back a couple for our 3 types of DMs. We've got a one-to-one failover in a small system. We jump up to the medium size where we can have a ring and they can follow each other around in a 3-server environment we've got here, or we can have a dedicated hot standby failover server for larger deployments. Okay, beyond there, let's go and start to look at a redundant administration. This is involved with the database rather than the actual image data of your cameras. And here we've got a system. We've got like the HQ for Australia, and it's running its own CSM, its core service master, effectively like on its own server hardware, because this may be a very large network, and the client may want to have that. In the case here, we've got 3 DMs. One happens to be the HQ, and then we've got 2, like we indicated here, Sydney and Melbourne, over a WAN link. Again, those WAN links, may vary in size depending on the size of the cameras and what's required back at the HQ. But the CSM, and there's only one of those in the system, and they all then talk to CSSs, the core service slaves. And in the case we've got, 3 of those at each site, and then they all talk with their clients and their device managers locally, and then they operate there. So what happens if we lose the master? For whatever reason, it may be a network link, it could be a physical server failure, but anyway, the CSM is gone for all intents purposes across the system. Anyway, the systems then go into what they call island mode. Basically, they're all standalone. The CSSs at each site will then work with the respective DMs. The data for the images for the cameras are all on the local device managers, and the live images for the cameras are also fed directly from your client. What's there? So for all intents and purposes, it's still operational is what's going on there. But again, we can have other scenarios that happen in the situation. Say we've got a scenario where you lose the connection with your CSS on the local branch. So where that shows the dotted line coming down, again, that could be running on its own hardware locally. So if that comms goes down on the CSS, what does the branch DM and the client do? Well, they'll realize that there is a failure with the CSS, and automatically they will, without any intervention from the user, they will try and connect to the CSM, the master, to get their instructions as such. So again, nothing is done by the operator. They may not even know that it's happened. Alarms and alerting, and that can be set up so it's brought to the attention of the respective parties to know that there is a problem and have it attended to. But this happens all in the background, and it's all within the Cayuga VMS. There is nothing external, no add-ons for the system. Anyway, it all gets rectified and the system gets back online in its normal state, and we're back up and running. And those communication paths that are there, they're shown in the thicker green lines. You have the CSM then is back talking to all the respective branches, and any changes that have occurred while it was offline will be then uploaded to the master in his case there. Now, the part I want to say here, like we've looked at the failovers for your image data for your cameras, and that's one aspect for it. And then we've looked at the administration for having multiple CSSs, these slaves in the system to handle the other functions. You can combine those two functions and even expand on that further here, though I haven't made the drawing busier, but we can actually have, you know, device managers, multiple within each site. So while you've still got CSSs, you may have only got a single device manager here. We can have a failover, a one-to-one or one-to-many. It depends on how big each of these local sites that are. So that covers both possibilities when you're losing your administration with all your database functions, as well as your image recording over to your multiple DMs. Again, I'll cover this. We'll look at one of these in the new year in another webinar where we can expand it even further, where we can have, you know, dual recording, you know, situations where we've got the cameras sending their streams to multiple DMs simultaneously. So they are live getting their streams. So you are not having any downtime whatsoever in the case of a device manager going offline and switching over to its failover before the cameras are recording again. And, you know, there is a slight delay in what's there. So that's what we've got in that side of things. So in summary, we'll just look at some of the parts here. Like, yes, if you have your recording server failure, you know, it goes down, your images are not recorded, and hence why we need to have a failover situation. Again, it can be a one or one-to-many side of things. It doesn't matter. It all comes down to the amount of cameras on the site and the expectations, you know, of the customer, or whether they're going to have a dedicated or a shared DM. And again, the sizing of these, you know, what's actually needed, you know, is first probably looked at within the tool, which is available online at the SeeTec site, that you can actually see the throughput and what's required in terms of the cameras, in terms of processing power and its storage capabilities, and then you can then work out, you know, the cost, you know, side from there. The redundancy side, you know, the CSM, the CSS. Again, how they all work. Again, I just want to stress again, a CSM, the master, that can reside on a DM. It doesn't have to have its own dedicated piece of hardware. And likewise with a CSS, the slave can also reside on a DM. So, you know, in the simplest scenario when we looked at the beginning where we had two DMs failing one to the other, you can have one can be the master, one can be the slave, so it can actually have the two functions. And the overhead that it has to perform these roles is minimal. It's not a very taxing device. That's what's required on the overall hardware. It happens all in the background. Anything changes, you know, it just, you know, goes on. It doesn't require any intervention, and that's, you know, the best scenario. You can't sort of really have it that it's going to be offline and somebody has to do something. It just does it by itself. So some of the points, you know, that I just want to stress, and, you know, I'll just expand a couple of these bullet points. There are no third-party items in terms of software or hardware that's involved with deploying a Cayuga VMS in a situation when you want to have a failover or a redundancy. It is all done within its own hardware. Again, those cost reductions, you're not having any additional third-party hardware and software. You've got your initial licensing, you know, for your software, and then you've got your ongoing maintenance and your releases for that associated software. The configuration, it's all done within Cayuga. Again, the last 2 points are going to go hand in hand. If it's all done within there, we haven't got any additional training or certification. You know, your local staff, they just need to be proficient in one piece of software, and that's the VMS, and that can be deployed in the various flavors, whether it's a small standalone system for up to 50 cameras, or a large system that may be many hundreds or thousands of cameras that are actually got on the system with multiple servers. But that's the part, when you actually look at all the hardware required, especially as the system grows, it becomes a lot more cost effective to look at a Cayuga when compared to some of the other products that are around the place. So that's been a fairly quick view over about the redundancy for the administration side and the failover for the image data for your recording of your cameras. But, as always, if you'd like to know more, the brochures, data sheets, and the other information, please, have a look at our website and subscribe to our Pulse magazine. That will email to you automatically. Or if you want to pick up the phone, talk to myself or my other colleagues, Jeff Rushton or Chris Ireland, that look after the various areas around the country. And I'll just leave that slide up there for a few minutes in case you want to jot their email and or phone numbers and that down there. And we've got a multitude of social media sites where you can find a lot more information, product reviews, tests, configuration videos. Our YouTube site, Jeff has done a great job there. He's got a lot of product in it up there that'll keep you interested for hours down there. So please don't feel free, to be a stranger. If you need anything else, just give us a holler. So that basically concludes this afternoon. Bit quicker than normal, so probably you can get back to things that you might have had planned towards the end of the day. It's our final in our series for this year. We'll be looking at other webinars in 2019. But if you have anything else you'd like to know, please reach out, and we're more than happy to talk to you and give you any additional information that you need on the Cayuga, the VMS products. Anyway, good afternoon, and thank you very much.